Tony Soprano is dark, manipulative, and ruthless. Crafty enough to play both sides of the fence in the war for control of the Lupertazzi family, yet cold enough to take one of his oldest friends out to sea and listen to his last request before killing him.
Jesus Christ. I pull the underwear out of my crack. Man's got to go comfortable.
But does that mean he has the makings of a varsity Machiavellian? Welcome to another Machiavellian Monday here on Bully Whispers, and for the new viewers, Machiavellianism is much more specific than just who's the best schemer, or some general notion that the ends justify the means. The Prince is essentially a how-to-rule manual for current or aspiring leaders, detailing the most effective ways to deal with specific circumstances and different types of people based on Machiavelli's historical observations. So, how Machiavellian was Tony Soprano? In evaluating this question, we'll focus primarily on a couple of surprising personality traits of Tony's and how they affected his actions from a Machiavellian standpoint, which are most noticeable in his dealings with Junior, Johnny Sack, Christopher, Tony B, Vito, Ralphie, and of course the war with New York. Machiavelli describes 3 levels of intellect, and Tony clearly doesn't belong in the third or lowest group, which is incapable of understanding anything. With the second group being capable of understanding what is shown to them, and the first group being capable of innovation, Tony seems to lean more towards level 1 than level 2. However, he does show a lack of awareness caused by his self-centered nature, which would prevent him from being on the same level as someone like Carmine Sr. This often keeps him out of touch with his own perception, which will prove problematic for him at times, especially after he makes it to the top. In order to evaluate that rise to the top, we must first take a look at the system he was presented with. He was essentially a noble in an aristocracy where he was vying for the position of prince with his uncle Junior. According to Machiavelli, this setup is easier to conquer but harder to hold because it only takes one disgruntled noble to gain access to the target, but once the deed is done, one must fear retribution from the other nobles. Adding on to that premise, Machiavelli also points out that princes held in low esteem are easier to conspire against because there will be more willing conspirators and less to fear in terms of retribution. Now these are principles which will be revisited later when Tony is at the top, but for the time being, Tony is held in high esteem, and Junior is not. This is evidenced by the number of capos willing to go behind Junior's back and participate in the illusion that he was boss. But why go with an illusion to begin with and not just take over? Initially, this makes sense in keeping with the Machiavellian principle of not rocking the boat unnecessarily, so to speak, but it doesn't explain the lack of any retaliation against Junior specifically after the attempt on Tony's life fails. When looking into this, we run into arguably the most famous Machiavellian question of them all: is it better to be loved or feared? According to the Prince, ultimately it's better to be feared, as long as you aren't hated, because while you can't make people love you, you can make them fear you. As much as Tony presents himself to be on the fear side, or as he would put it, respect.
What happens I decide, not you. Now, you don't love me anymore, well, that breaks my heart, but it's too fucking bad, because you don't gotta love me. But you will respect me.
He actually falls in line with the desire to be loved side of that equation much more than he realizes, and this is why he's always worried about being toxic.
I mean, what the fuck am I? A toxic person or something? What am I, a toxic person?
In regards to his rise to power, it's easy to say that Tony took the gentle route with Junior because he was family, they used to play catch together, etc., but having his course of action influenced by a desire to be loved is something that will show up again, suggesting this may be more of a character trait than just a singular incident.
Don't you love me?
Either way, he managed to become boss while maintaining the appearance that Junior was, showing himself to be a capable fox, and he managed to avoid some snares. But in doing so, he made several Machiavellian mistakes. First, when obtaining a principality through wickedness, you must start off violent and then ease up, using it only sparingly and to obvious benefit. If you start off mildly or in a more timid fashion, it is much harder to escalate the violence later without provoking hatred, and having to, as Machiavelli put it, keep a knife in hand at all times. Tony chose the clement path with Junior, and while Machiavelli says it is good to be viewed as clement, it's better to be viewed as cruel than as someone who through mercy allows disorder to arise. Now, just like with the loved versus feared principle, this infraction with Junior is a minor example, but it also demonstrates a pattern that he will repeat as boss in more serious situations. Also, in his effort to avoid the so-called cruel route with Junior, he sought out the help of Johnny Sack.
First of all, Junior can't know how we talked. He's got to think that Hesh came to you on his own, by himself.
You are still running things.
According to Machiavelli, a prince should never let a strong rival gain a foothold in his territory because the disgruntled will naturally flock to him. And right there, Tony gave Johnny Sack an end to his family business. As the show progresses, we see Johnny Sack's footprint increase as he becomes more involved, moves to New Jersey, and, just as predicted, the disgruntled flock to him. Through people such as Polly Walnuts and Ralph Cifaretto, he was able to gain inside information on Soprano family business and was in a prime position to either squash or stir up trouble within their family as he saw fit. Regardless of his missteps, Tony becomes boss of New Jersey and finds out the job is more complicated than he had previously thought. According to Machiavelli, no government should ever assume it can choose perfectly the safe courses, rather let it expect to take doubtful ones. Conflict is unavoidable. It must learn to identify the characters of trouble and choose the lesser evil, which is a concept Junior puts into focus for him.
That's what being a boss is. You steer the ship the best way you know. Sometimes it's smooth, sometimes you hit the rocks.
This is why Machiavelli stresses the importance of taking good advice from good advisors, and this is where we get to Syl. Syl is a good advisor with his ear to the ground, especially when it comes to troop sentiment and morale.
But you cut Vito slack now that he's out of the closet? Just the excuse people need to go off the reservation.
And to his credit, Tony is usually very good at taking Syl's advice, but no amount of good advice can overcome his self-centered lack of awareness once he's boss. The last element thrown into this mix is a personality trait of Tony's that many may find surprising. According to the prince, it is better to be bold than cautious because, with a few exceptions, good fortune is like a woman, a lover of men with the audacity to command her, and we certainly see Tony bossing some ladies around. Or at least trying to, often unsuccessfully.
Unfucking believable. All of them. Every fucking girl in my life.
Similarly, as much as Tony presents himself to be the bold, decisive type, and is even viewed that way by others,
I tell you though, when I first met him, decisive as he is, I would have been proud to call him my own son.
he really isn't. What is often viewed as decisiveness is actually just impulsiveness due to his temper, and once that moment is past, he's usually very slow to act. This combination of his lack of awareness, his desire to be loved, and his indecisive nature really start to come into focus when looking at how he deals with his people and his attempt to keep his mob family together, most specifically Christopher, Tony B, Vito, and Ralphie. Tony loves Christopher, feels an obligation towards him, and desperately wants Chris to love him back. As a result, he's always letting Chris get away with things that others could not, all the while fast-tracking him up the ladder, which did cause some friction with others, like when he was made acting capo. This friction is minimal in Chris's case, though, because he usually makes up with others quickly. The big, long-standing tensions were with Tony directly, so it didn't spill over to the rest of the family in the same way it did with Tony B. Much like with Chris, Tony loves Tony B and feels obligated to him despite the favor he had already done for him.
They will probably go through their entire lives not knowing that their father's sperm was smuggled out of jail to get Nancy pregnant.
It's the least I could do.
Also, like with Chris, Tony B was able to get away with things others weren't while getting pushed up the ladder. However, unlike with Chris, Tony B's problems entangle the family as a whole when he jumped into the New York power struggle, despite Tony wanting to stay neutral. Through leniency, Tony had allowed chaos to arrive, which greatly hurt his reputation among his family, and the time had come to act, which Tony did, eventually. Quick side note, I mentioned the sense of obligation Tony felt along with the love towards Chris and Tony B to bring up the other aspect of why it is better to be feared than loved. According to Machiavelli, love is preserved by the link of obligation, and due to the baseness of human nature, will be broken for personal benefit or interests. We see this play out with both of them. Anyways, with Vito, the desire to be loved doesn't come into play like it does with Chris and Tony B, but nevertheless, Tony was willing to let him get away with things that others weren't. Now, whether this was due to leniency or practical reasons is irrelevant because he was so slow to act that the damage to his reputation had been done, both within his family and with New York. Eventually, Phil Leotardo finds and kills Vito, and what Tony does with the money meant for Vito's family runs him afoul of yet another Machiavellian principle. According to the prince, it helps one's reputation to squander other people's money, but it hurts one's reputation greatly to squander that of his and his men. It had long been known that Tony was a gambler who blew his money regularly.
I've known him a long time. Money goes in one hand and right out the other. The more he makes, the more he spends.
But that never really bothered anybody because it was his money. In this instance, however, even though the money wasn't going to the others, it was easier for them to visualize it being their family's money he was squandering if they were to die, and Tony's reputation was plummeting. You see, according to Machiavelli, on a quest to inspire fear, if a prince can't win love, which Tony couldn't, then he must at least avoid being hated. He must abstain from violating the property and women of his people, and when it's necessary for him to proceed against the life of another, he must do it on proper justification. Which brings us to Ralph Cifaretto, where all three of those factors come into play. Ralph showed back up on the scene after spending years in Miami and immediately wanted to take over the April crew. Now, according to the prince, Ralph would be the right choice because he came from that group, and credit be given where credit is due, Tony did the Machiavellian thing and put Ralph in charge. Eventually, which fits right in with his lack of decisiveness. After finally putting the right guy in charge, Tony couldn't help himself from taking Ralph's money, his horse, and his girlfriend. On top of that, despite not taking quick, decisive action against Chris, Tony B, or Vito, all of whom would have had proper justification by mob standards, he proceeds to beat Ralph to death in a fit of rage over a horse. This, of course, doesn't go unnoticed by others. Eventually, New Jersey and New York go to war, and while there were many factors at play, as well as multiple instigators,
I blame that Minnie Matron. She's a malignant cunt.
Tony's missteps certainly played a part. When it comes to the actual war with New York, however brief it was, Tony followed Machiavellian strategy fairly well. Since he didn't intend to conquer, his strategy of using mercenaries was acceptable in theory, even if it didn't work out in practice. He also used mutual losses to bring Phil's people closer in an effort to get them to sell Phil out. And since this is not a video about whether or not Tony was shot at the end, he seems to have survived the war with New York. But what situation did he find himself in then? This is where we circle back to the two Machiavellian principles that defined his conflict with Junior during his rise. He occupies a position which is easy to conquer because it only takes one upset noble to gain access, and it only gets easier to conspire against him the lower his esteem falls. We saw how easy it was to conspire against Junior because they held him in such low regards, and we saw how Tony's reputation made it hard to do so against him when Richie April and Junior tried shortly thereafter. But by the end of the series, Tony's reputation was a shell of its former self, and he had enemies in all directions. Even assuming he wasn't about to get indicted, or shot, his prospects for the future looked pretty bleak. Machiavelli says that good fortune is the reason for half of our actions, but the rest is free will. A prince can seem happy today and ruined tomorrow if they rely on good fortune and it changes, which may be a great description for what happened to Tony. He managed to stay on top for quite some time despite his disregard for his own reputation, his surprising indecisiveness, and the ridiculously preferential treatment he gave to certain people. His luck just ran out, which would fit with his own view of his life.
Right now. Why the fuck now? Just when things were going good.
Thanks for watching another episode here on Bully Whispers. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next score.